I want to talk to you for a few minutes about primitive church pews. In their simplest form, they are four pieces. There's a back, a seat, and two ends. These are made out of lumber that was usually locally available. In other words, they cut the trees down, they pit sawed the logs into slabs, they hand planed the slabs, they put them together as church pews. Some more elaborate ones may have had a skirt or a seat support went under the seat from side to side to help support the seat. Some others may have had some trim along the top of the back and the top of the ends. But basically they're straight-lined, primitive, simple boards put together with square nails. They're from the era of early 1800s to probably 1870, 75 in that neighborhood. You might see some with circular saw marks that were a little later up close to 1900, but most of them, if they got any saw marks on them, they're from a pit saw because they're from an older time than circular saw blades were available to cut. Some of the extra things you might look for are songbook holders, and these usually weren't on them in the beginning. They were added sometime later, probably halfway through the life of the pew or even later than that. What I call a deep skirt, which would be a seat support that went almost to the ground. Sometimes it did go to the ground, right to the bottom of the legs. These were extras because you got an extra board when you bought one that had this feature. Over the course of the time that I've had an interest and bought and sold primitive church pews, probably I'm going to guess about 45 years, last 45 years. I have maybe owned 100 plus or minus primitive church pews. And that seems like probably a big number, but on more than one occasion I have bought them in quantities of 10 to 20, maybe even 30 at one time. The raised church pews and the Shiloh church pews, which I have videos in the can about both of those groups of church pews. In both of those instances I bought a rather large lot of church pews. Then there were the Bowman pews, and I call them the Bowman pews because the guy's name I bought them from was Bowman. He got them from his association with some church that was trying to get rid of them, and he was kind of like a middleman where I bought those. I bought several from him in that situation. I had several from the Leesville Methodist Church. That church has been closed for a long time, and it eventually burned after it was closed. Leesville was the oldest community in Lawrence County, so those pews date back for a while. I had several of those pews, and I still have one. I probably owned that pew 40 or 45 years. I bought some from a Hard Rock Baptist church. I don't know where they called that, the Hard Rock Baptist or the Indian Creek Baptist. It was from over in Greene County. And I bought a lot of two other times. Once in Owen County I bought several pews at once at an auction. I don't know what the origin of those pews were. And then another time, I can't remember the name of the little town. It's you start up 67 from Martinsville toward Mooresville, and then you go off on 39 up Monrovia, I think is the name of the place. I bought several church pews there. So I've owned a lot of them. I still like to buy them. I'll buy them in any condition because what I'm really after is those old, gorgeous, hand-planed boards to do things with. And the church pews are always worth something as a church pew. People want them. They command a pretty steady, decent price around here. I'm going to add this, and then I think I'll close and go on with other business. But I think the most expensive primitive church pew I ever saw was at the American Pickers place in Iowa. I stopped there. I looked around on the way home from the Black Hills one year, Betty and I did, and they had a primitive church pew in their building, and they wanted, and I can't remember exactly, it was at least $385, it might have been $435. They had that kind of a price on a primitive church pew. And Betty said, my gosh, we need to sell them some primitive church pews. I said, they are not wanting to sell that pew. They just have it here for the ambience that it gives their shop, and they know that a primitive church pew like that's not worth that kind of money. At least I think they do. So in southern Indiana, if you got $150 in your pocket and you're looking seriously, you can buy lots of primitive church pews. That is a Shiloh primitive church pew. I know it because I bought it right out of the Shiloh church. If I didn't know that, I still would know it because it has the two features that Shiloh church pews have. There's one. You see that skirt under the seat where it's jointed to the leg? There's a dovetail joint there. It's a pretty unusual joint for a primitive church pew. When you find one in Lawrence County that's like that, you can be almost sure it's a Shiloh pew. The other feature that most Shiloh pews have, but not all of them, is this feature. This is a board that was left over from a Shiloh church pew that was cut down. You see the end of that board, how it's concave on the bottom? They planed the top straight and flat. They didn't bother to plane the bottom and get a uniform thickness throughout the seat. That's another feature of most Shiloh church pews. There are a few, you find a few of them that don't have that feature. They actually have a uniform thickness in the seat, and but not very many. In that stack of boards right there, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 boards that are salvaged from various primitive church pews, and the one second from the bottom is an example of a Shiloh seat that is a uniform thickness. I've only seen a couple of them like that, and I wouldn't have thought they were Shiloh pews except that I knew they were Shiloh pews. I bought them at the Shiloh church auction, and they have the Shiloh paint history on them. So very few of those, but some Shiloh pews that have the dovetail joint and don't have the concave seat bottom. While I'm here, I'm going to show you another board. Can you see that big wide board there underneath? Yeah. Isn't that a beauty? The thing's about 12 feet long and it's 22 inches wide. I've had that board for, I don't know, 35 or 40 years. I've always wanted to make something out of it, but I've never found a project that was worthy of me cutting that board up. So there it is. One of these days, maybe. 22 inches wide, inch and a half thick. There's some more wide poplar boards that at one time in their existence were primitive church pews. In fact, that longest one there, you can see where the songbook holders were on the back. It was painted white and it was painted gray, and they didn't take the songbook holders off when they painted it gray, and so you can see where the songbook holders were on it. In fact, I still have one of those songbook holders. Sold the other one. But those are boards that were at one time primitive church pews. I've cut them down, made things out of them, used the boards for something else, and I've got those boards left waiting for a worthy project. Shiloh was the first Methodist church built in Indian Creek Township. That denomination held services before the first Shiloh church building was erected. Several families named Garton, all of whom were Methodists, had immigrated from Kentucky. Richard Browning was a Methodist circuit rider in Kentucky and became the local preacher for Shiloh. In 1821, a little log church was erected on Mr. Pittman's place and called Shiloh. It stood near the site of the present meeting house, 3 miles east of Fayetteville. The community around the present church is known as Eureka, Indiana. The history of Lawrence County records the names of several of the early members. The preacher, Richard Browning, drowned after serving there 8 years. Several of the early preachers' names are listed in this same book. I believe the original building burned, but I'm not sure of this. In 1840, the existing frame building was erected on the same site. It housed the Methodists for a number of years, but was eventually closed. Several different denominations have used the building as a meeting place over the years. There is a cemetery on the property, also known as Shiloh Cemetery. A large sinkhole has developed in the center of this cemetery. There is also a large cave system of the same name. The opening to this cave is behind the church building, and the caverns extend under the church and the cemetery. The church, for a period of time in the 1980s, was known as the Shiloh Christian Fellowship. I attended the church with my family for part of this time. There were several primitive pews of varying lengths from 8 to 12 feet being used. I believe these pews were constructed from local timbers when the church was built in 1840. The wide yellow poplar boards were hand planed. The square-head nails are consistent with nails from that period. The plank seat boards were extra thick and concave on the bottom. The skirts under the front of the seats were dovetailed into the legs on the end of the pews. Some years after our family left, more modern pews were purchased, and the church sold some of the primitive ones at auction. I missed that auction, but a few years later, the remainder of the primitive pews were sold. I managed to buy most of the pews sold in the second sale. Over time, I cut many of these down to 42 or 48-inch lengths and sold them. Boards salvaged from these have been used to build Hard Times original furniture, much like the raised church pews. The concave seat bottoms and the dovetail skirts are unique features, I believe, found only in Shiloh pews. If you live in Lawrence County and have a primitive yellow poplar pew with these features, you probably own a Shiloh pew.